This week we're reading Leviticus 11. I'm not going to do the whole thing, just parts of it. So we'll start at verse 1. Leviticus 11, 1 to 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and chews the cud. There are some that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof. You must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The hyrax, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you." Now we'll jump to verse 26. Every animal that does not have a divided hoof or does not chew the cud is unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash their clothes and will be unclean until evening. These animals are unclean for you. And finally, we'll read from verse 41. Every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as unclean. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is unclean. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living creature that moves along the ground and in the water, and every creature that moves along the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten.
Thank you, Georgia, and good morning, everyone. Have you ever underestimated the importance of something only to pay for it later? Let me tell you about a time that I did. When we first arrived in Southeast Asia, there was this wonderful Dutch lady from our mission agency who sat us down and explained all the logistical things that we needed to do. And I remember her very clearly saying that there's a quirk to the visa situation. We got this 1-year visa, but the permission to go in and out of the country was only 6 months. So she said, don't forget, 6 months' time, go back to immigration and renew that permission to go in and out. If you don't, you won't be able to get out of the country if you need to. It was really good advice, but I forgot. In the midst of all the exciting things that we had to do, throwing ourselves into new ministries and new lives, it just didn't seem that important to me. Well, 9 months later, Anna and I were brushing our teeth, getting ready for the day. Our 1-year-old son, Liam, was playing with our house helper, and Liam had a really bad fall. And we rushed him to hospital. He was in terrible pain. I'd never seen him cry like that. All the drive to the hospital and the waiting in the emergency, the waiting for an x-ray, he was crying in a way I'd never heard him cry. And eventually we got the diagnosis, which was that his femur, the thigh bone, had snapped completely in two, and he needed to be put ideally into this special cast called a spiker cast that would go from your chest all the way down to your foot. But this hospital wasn't able to do that. What they were able to do was traction, sort of lying on a bed with those strings attached to you for 6 weeks. So we started to get our head around the idea of our 1-year-old lying on his back for 6 weeks in traction. And he was just crying and crying. And that night he was in the hospital cot. He was crying so much, Anna ended up climbing into the cot with him somehow to sort of comfort him. And as she did that, she spent the night comforting him. She noticed that he wasn't moving his neck at all. And the next day, we went off to have more x-rays, and we found out that he also had a really serious neck injury. There was a vertebra in his neck which had slid out of place when he had that fall, and we were now told he needed to keep his head completely immobilised. Any movement could result in him being paralysed for life. What Liam needed was a spinal surgeon, and the good news was that one short flight away in Singapore, there was a spinal surgeon who could treat him. Well, at this point, our emergency evacuation insurance kicked in, and it was amazing how quickly everything moved. Suddenly, this team turned up at the hospital, and with great care, they moved Liam from his hospital bed to a stretcher. They took him out to an ambulance, always making sure not to move his head. From the ambulance, we drove through our city to the airport, and there was a special emergency air ambulance waiting for Liam, and we were wheeled onto this ambulance all the while, being sure not to move his head, but all the while doing it all really quickly because time was of the essence and he needed to get to this spinal surgeon quickly. We were sitting on the plane. There was us, there was the nurse, the insurance people, there was the pilots, it was our plane. The engine was running, we were ready to go, and then there was a knock on the plane door. The pilot got out of his chair, opened the door. It was an immigration official. Immigration official gestures for me to go with him. Anna stays comforting Liam while he's still on the plane. They usher me into this room at the airport. They sit me down and say, "You can't leave. Your permission to go in and out of the country expired 3 months ago." I say, "It's a medical emergency." They say, "We're sorry." I say, "My son could be paralysed. He might never walk again." "We're sorry. It expired 3 months ago. Without that permission, you can't leave." The words of that Dutch lady came back to me, "Don't forget." But I had forgotten. I just hadn't thought it would be that important. Now, this story, praise God, ends well, as those of you that know Liam, who walks around today, can tell. But there was a good while before I knew that it would end well. And in the hours that I spent negotiating in that airport room, while critically injured Liam waited on the plane, I sat with an awful question. What might my underestimating of the importance of that permission, what might it cost? Have you ever underestimated the importance of something? Are we, before God, currently underestimating the importance of something? See, I wonder if we might be doing that with holiness. I don't think you'll find someone here at SMBC who's going to say holiness isn't important. I didn't actually say that about the visa permission. But I wonder if, like me with that visa permission, we don't see it as that much of a priority so that it gets pushed down the list or gets neglected. Author Kevin DeYoung thinks that we underestimate the importance of holiness. He's written a book called A Hole in Our Holiness, and he says that he thinks that for many contemporary evangelical Christians today, people like you and me, there's a gap between our gospel passion and our pursuit of holiness. Have a listen to what he writes. He says, "My fear is that we rightly celebrate and in some quarters rediscover all that Christ has saved us from. But we're giving little thought and making little effort concerning all that Christ has saved us to. Shouldn't those most passionate about the gospel and God's glory also be those most dedicated to the pursuit of holiness? I worry that there's an enthusiasm gap and no one seems to mind." What do you think? Is that true of you? Is that true of me? Is there an enthusiasm gap? Is it true of us as a community of people here at SMBC? Passionate about the gospel, but not as passionate about holiness. If there is any truth to this, it's time for a course correction, because God cares about holiness. And in Leviticus 11, he calls us to care about holiness the way he cares about holiness. Please have your Bibles open to Leviticus 11. We're going to ask of this text the question, what's so important about holiness? What's so important about holiness? And we're going to find two answers today. First one is this. At stake is access to our holy God's presence. At stake is access to our holy God's presence. Let's set the scene for chapter 11. The previous chapters have highlighted the incredible blessing of being in God's presence, but at the same time, the incredible danger. Chapter 8, those priests, they got set apart, consecrated to serve at the tabernacle. And then in chapter 9, when they made their offerings, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And you remember what happened when the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people? They fell down and shouted for joy, fell face down. This was a picture of the incredible blessing of access to God's presence. That was chapter 9. But then in chapter 10, the danger of that access became all too clear, didn't it, when Nadab and Abihu were incinerated. Blessing, but also danger. And so that brings us to the next section of the book that we're starting now in chapter 11, and it runs through to chapter 15. It's dealing with this urgent need which has just been highlighted in the previous chapters, and that is, how can Israel be in God's presence, that place of blessing, and at the same time survive it? Because it's a place of danger. Israel needs to know when it's safe to go there, when it's safe to enter. And Leviticus 11 to 15 comes in here because Leviticus 11 to 15 provides laws on unclean and clean. Laws that explain when a person is clean and able to enter, and when a person is unclean and should stay away. Today it's just chapter 11. Chapter 11, as you would have heard before when Georgia read it, is all about animals. About eating animals and about touching dead animals. The main focus of the first section is about eating. It sets out animals which are clean and which are unclean, and the rules are very simple. If an animal is unclean, you mustn't eat it. For an example, have a look at verse 11, where it explains, it says, verse 11, chapter 11, since you are to regard them, it's talking about the unclean sea creatures at this point, since you are to regard them as unclean, you must not eat their meat. Very simple, straightforward rule, and you must regard their carcasses as unclean too. That's the focus of the first section. The second section focuses on touching carcasses, dead animals, and explains again which animals, if you touch their carcasses, will make you unclean. Have a look at verse 26, for example. Every animal that does not have a divided hoof or that does not chew the cud is unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. That's section 1. Section 2, the final section, which we'll get to in a moment, is a concluding exhortation. So that's an outline of the chapter. As you can see, most of this chapter is filled with long lists of animals, which ones are clean, which ones are unclean, so that Israel knows what they can eat, Israel knows what they can touch. Let's take a step back now and try to think about what this all means. What we need to see is what these laws are doing. These laws are helping the Israelites to determine what their ritual state is, what their ritual state of being is. See, to be clean in Leviticus 11 is to be in a ritual state of being which determines your access to God's presence. It doesn't mean to be hygienically clean. It's not like pork has more germs than lamb. It's not talking about that. And it doesn't mean to be clean from sin. If we read through the laws on clean and unclean, you'll see that many of the things that make you ritually unclean are not sins. Like having sex or giving birth are actually good things which God commanded humanity to do back in Genesis 1. But they will make you ritually unclean. So it doesn't mean clean from sin. In fact, you might be ritually clean, but still have some sins that you need to atone for. And you'll do that with the sacrifices we looked at a few weeks ago, the sin offering, the guilt offering. You'll go to the temple to make those offerings to have your sin dealt with. So to be unclean, not talking about being hygienically clean, it's not even talking about being clean from sin. What it means is that you're in a ritual state which gives you access to God's presence. And there were 3 possible states that an Israelite could be in. There was unclean, there was clean, and there was holy. And as an Israelite, your default ritual state was clean, that one in the middle. But you could downgrade to unclean For example, you touch an unclean carcass, that would defile you, that would make you unclean, and then you'd need to wait a certain period, and depending on what you'd done and what you touched, go through some kind of cleansing or purification before you'd be ritually clean again. Or if you're clean from that status, you could upgrade to holy, and that's what we saw the priests doing last week in chapter 8. With that ritual where they had the blood on the earlobe and so on, they were being consecrated, set apart. They were becoming holy. Now, what ritual state you're in matters because it determines your access to God's presence. If you are clean, you have limited access to some parts of the tabernacle, some holy places. For example, the entrance where you would bring your offerings. Now, if you're holy, you can go deeper into the tabernacle and closer to the presence of God. If you're unclean, you have to stay away completely from the tabernacle. Because if you're unclean and you come into contact with the holy, you die. Holiness destroys uncleanness. Chapter 15, verse 31 says, "You must keep the Israelites separate from the things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them." That's 15, verse 31. Holiness destroys uncleanness. So you see that these clean and unclean laws, what they are is they're survival laws for Israel. They're laws that help Israel to survive God's presence, to survive the blessing of having this holy God dwell among them. Our question is, what's so important about holiness? Holiness matters. Cleanness matters because at stake is being fit for the presence of a holy God. Now, when you think about these laws and what they would have meant for daily life for the Israelites, and then you reflect on all societies and cultures around the world, we all have some habits and some rituals, things that we do regularly that communicate or even inculcate some special message or meaning to us when we do them. You think about it, around the world, many people from many cultures and religions will pray before they eat. And as they do that, it regularly reinforces this message. It's important to be thankful. When I was a kid in primary school, we had this ritual we did every morning, which was raising the flag. And doing that reinforced this message. It's important to honour, to celebrate the nation. In many Asian cultures, when you meet someone, you bow your head. You might do that 50, 60 times a day. Just bow your head. It reinforces this message. It's important to show others respect. So the more we do these habits, every time we do it, it reinforces, it reminds us of this message. Now, God had a message he really wanted to inculcate, to communicate to Israel. He built it into them every mealtime, 3 times a day, every time Israel ate. This message they would be reminded of. It doesn't get much more basic than that, your access to food. What was this message that God wanted to build into Israel's everyday life? It was that holiness matters, that cleanness matters. God is holy, and if we want to be in his presence, and there is no better place to be, if we want to be in his presence, we need to be clean. Every single time Israel ate food, they were reminded of that truth. So our question today, what's so important about holiness? The first answer we're seeing is that at stake is access to our holy God's presence. For an Israelite, if you were ritually unclean, it meant separation from God's presence. And this whole system of ritual states is pointing to a profound truth that holiness matters. If you want to relate to a holy God, you need to realise that holiness matters. And if you thought the stakes were getting fairly high already by the time we get to this concluding exhortation, just look how the chapter finishes. I want to read out from verse 42. And as I read, I want you to ask yourself if there's any phrase in here that reminds you of anything. Verse 42, "You're not to eat any creature that moves along the ground. whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is unclean. I can see a few heads nodding. Did that remind you of anything? That phrase, moves on its belly. It occurs one other time in the Bible. Genesis 3, verse 14, when the serpent is cursed after tempting Adam and Eve to do what? To eat what is forbidden. This is no accident here. This is something which the author wants Israel to remember. They want Israel to remember Eden, remember what happened there. Back in Eden, God had told Adam what Adam and Eve could eat from any tree in the garden and what was forbidden, that one particular tree. And when they disobeyed, what happened? They were banished from God's presence. Now here in Leviticus 11, God is telling Israel what they can eat, these clean animals, what is forbidden, the unclean animals, and what will happen if they disobey. They too will be banished from God's tabernacle presence. You see how high the stakes are? You see what God is saying here? He's saying, don't forget Eden. Don't forget what happened there. Don't repeat that mistake. And then with that warning fresh in our ears comes this concluding appeal where the meaning of the chapter crystallizes. Verse 44, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, be holy because I am holy. Be holy because I am holy, says God. Holiness matters. It's important because it's important to God. It's important because God is holy. If Israel wants to enjoy life with him, Israel needs to realise that they need to be holy too. And these laws about ritual cleanness help us to see that. So our question today, what's so important about holiness? The first answer we've just seen is what's at stake is access to a holy God's presence. Let's look at the second answer now. Also at stake is reflecting God's holiness to a watching world. Reflecting God's holiness to a watching world. God never intended to bless and to rescue Israel just for Israel's own sake. Right from the beginning, from Genesis 12, the plan was always that Israel would be blessed in order to be a blessing, that they would implement God's mission to reach and bless and save all nations. And God planned to do that through the holiness of his people. Just think back to that momentous moment at Mount Sinai when he declared who Israel was. He says, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, mediators between unclean nations and a holy God, mediators, missional mediators, and a holy nation. That's the way they were going to do it, through their holiness. The food laws were a reminder to Israel of their role. Just flip ahead to Leviticus 20, where God makes this clear. Leviticus 20, I'm going to read from verse 23. Leviticus 20, verse 23, God says, you must not live according to the customs of the nations I'm going to drive out before you. And I'll skip to the end of 24. I am the Lord your God who set you apart from the nations. Verse 25, you must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground, those that I have set apart as unclean for you. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. You see what the laws are doing here? The laws are to remind Israel that they are set apart from the nations. They're separate, they're distinct, they're holy, they're distinctive. They have a crucial role to play in God's plan of reflecting his holiness to the world. The nations, they eat unclean animals, and that points to their status as unclean before God. Israel eat only clean animals, pointing to their status as clean before God. And so you see this second function of the food laws. They're reminding Israel of their calling and purpose in the world to reflect God's holiness to a watching world. This would have been a daily reminder for Israel. Every time they watched a Canaanite enjoying a prawn laksa, every time they had the waft of the Canaanite bacon and egg roll being prepared and they wanted to taste it and they wanted to try it and then they restrained, it was a reminder of their role in the world. A holy people reflecting God's holiness to a watching world. What's so important about holiness? We've seen two things were at stake. First, access to God's holy presence, and secondly, reflecting God's holiness to a watching world. God's presence and God's mission. Or from Israel's perspective, Israel's worship and Israel's witness. A lot is at stake. And yet, if Kevin DeYoung is right, and I do suspect he's onto something, many of us underestimate the importance of holiness. For many of us, gospel-minded people, we have what he calls that enthusiasm gap, that gap between our passion to see the gospel go out and our lacklustre pursuit of holiness. If that's the case, why is that? Why is there this gap? There could be all sorts of reasons, couldn't there? Maybe we're keen to avoid some of the associations with holiness. We don't want to be fun killers. We don't want to be legalistic. We don't want to be judgmental, holier than thou. Or maybe we realise that holiness of life is hard work and we balk at that. Could be a whole range of things. I also wonder if part of it is that we either misunderstand or misapply some of the changes that Jesus brought. I want to highlight two big changes in this area that Jesus brought, which, if we misunderstand or we misapply, could lead us to underestimate, to downplay holiness in our lives. First one, Jesus said that the Leviticus 11 food laws don't apply anymore. Mark 7, he declared all food clean. That's the change he brought. The misunderstanding is to conclude that means that in the New Testament age, holiness just isn't as important as it used to be back then in the Old Testament age. Because that is wrong. Let's have a look at Mark 7 now. It'll be up on the screen. If you want to flip to it, you can. Let's have a look at Mark 7, because what I want us to see is that very moment that Jesus says all foods are clean, he also makes very clear that the truth to which those food laws pointed is as true as ever, that the truth to which those food laws pointed, that holiness matters, is as true today as it ever was. Mark 7, have a look. I'm going to read from verse 18. Jesus says, "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. And he went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." See, in this age in which we live, the New Covenant age, those Leviticus 11 food laws no longer apply, but the truth to which they pointed does. Holiness matters. Cleanness matters. We mustn't underestimate it. Jesus is saying here in Mark 7 that the evils of the heart make us unclean. Sexual immorality, greed, slander, these things make us unclean. This problem of uncleanness continues to be a problem that matters to God and should matter to us. That's the first change that Jesus brought that we could misunderstand. The second one is this. By Jesus' death, he makes us completely clean and completely holy before God. By Jesus' death, he makes us fit for God's presence in a way that no Old Testament purification ritual ever could. That's the wonderful change that he brought. The misapplication is to conclude that if he's already done that for me, then there's not that much point in me working too hard on my holiness of life. Now, there might sound like a certain logic to that, and I've certainly found my own thought systems going in that direction at times. It might sound like there's logic to it, but the problem is that's not the conclusion the New Testament authors draw. In fact, it's the opposite to the conclusion they draw. The New Testament authors say Jesus died to make us holy, and so that shows us how valuable and important holiness is. Jesus died to make us holy, so now we're free to live out that new wonderful reality of people made holy in our everyday life. Jesus died to make us holy, and so now we can show the watching world what our holy God is like. That's the conclusion that the New Testament authors draw. Take the Apostle Peter, for example. Peter was someone who knew that Jesus had declared all foods clean. If he forgot what Jesus had said in Mark 7, he was given a special vision in Acts just to confirm that. Peter knew that. He also knew that Jesus had made us permanently clean and holy before God. But that didn't lead Peter to conclude that holiness of life is not something that's important in the New Testament age. In his letter in 1 Peter, he calls us to pursue holiness. And when he does that, he quotes Leviticus 11 to make his point. Have a look at that, 1 Peter. I'm going to read from chapter 1, verse 14. 1 Peter 1:14. As obedient children, writes Peter, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. Holiness matters. Just as God once said to Israel, be holy because I'm holy, now he says to us, Christians, be holy because I am holy. And in the rest of the letter, Peter goes on to unpack this. And as he does so, it becomes very clear that what continues to be at stake is our mission to the world. Have a look at a section from chapter 2. I'll read from verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Verse 11, dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Holiness matters. At stake is access for the world to God's holy presence. At stake is us reflecting God's holiness to the watching world. See, in this age in which we live, God continues to carry out his mission to the world through the holiness of his people, us. I remember a conversation once I was part of with a group of missionaries. We were talking about a particular strategy for doing mission. And one of the people in the group was advancing this method, which seemed to be a little bit unethical. And someone else in the group asked about that. She said, well, wouldn't that be deceptive if we did that? And he replied, I don't think God would mind. What matters is the gospel goes out. I don't think God would mind. See, the God who says, be holy because I am holy, does mind. He cares about our holiness. Have you ever found yourself using that phrase before? Maybe not out loud like that guy, or maybe just to yourself. A lustful thought. I don't think God would mind. An act of greed, I don't think God would mind. A slander against a brother or sister, I don't think God would mind. Covering up a mistake that you've made with a lie, I don't think God would mind. The God who says, "Be holy because I am holy," does mind. He cares about our holiness. And today he's issuing us with this passionate invitation, just as I've already made you completely holy through Christ. Now strive to live out that reality in your everyday life. Be holy because I am holy, he says. John Chapman was a much-loved evangelist. He used to be a visiting lecturer here at SMBC. He died around 10 years ago. In his later life, when he'd been a Christian for almost 60 years, he wrote a testimony to his experience of pursuing holiness in life. And do you know what he called it? The first 60 years are the hardest. Have a listen to what he wrote. He wrote, "When I first became a Christian, I realised that I was to live a life of obedience to my new master. At the time, the theory of this seemed elementary and the Christian walk seemed such an easy thing to keep going with. The reality was that it turned out to be much more difficult than I thought. How I long to be holy and to be just like the Lord Jesus Christ. Achieving it is a different matter." And he goes on in this testimony to his experience that what he'd learned in those 60 years of striving for holiness was that it's hard work, it takes effort. That this whole process of keeping in step with the Holy Spirit, living out obedience to God's commands, conforming our desires to his, he said, that's hard work. But it's worth it. And my prayer today is that Leviticus 11 has shown us that this struggle, this effort, this hard work is worth it. Because holiness matters to our holy God.